Hello and welcome to Current Affairs on JTV. I was recently at the AIPAC conference in Washington, D.C., which is the largest gathering of pro-Israel supporters in the world. Here's a few of the characters I caught up with during the conference. Okay, Irwin, pleasure to have you join me today. Now, when we look at the boycott, divestment and sanctions campaign, some of us think it's a contemporary movement, but it isn't, is it? It's got far longer roots in history.
Well, we're meeting at an important moment of remembrance and reminder. It's the 40th anniversary of the coming into effect of the International Covenants on Civil and Political Rights, on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, together with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is considered to be the advent of the International Human Rights Revolution, of which Father Robert Drinan, Congressman Drinan, said at the time that the elevation of human rights into an international juridical norm is, as he put it, the most dramatic development in the history of contemporary jurisprudence. And this underpinned the struggle for Soviet Jewry at the time, one of the two great human rights movements of the second half of the 20th century, along with the struggle against apartheid. But there was a darker, obverse side to this human rights revolution. This was the advent of lawfare, of the delegitimization of Israel under the cover of law, of the attempt to portray Israel as the enemy of all that was good and the repository of all that was evil. And so you had at one and the same time, where human rights had emerged as the new secular religion of our time, there was the attempt to portray Israel not only as a meta human rights violator, but as the geopolitical antichrist of our time. And that was really the beginning of the phenomenon of what we call today a delegitimization. But there were a number of other developments that dovetailed with the coming into being of the BDS movement. There was the reframing of a reconfiguration, I would say, of the Arab-Israeli conflict as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There was the reframing of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as a human rights conflict. There was the characterization of that human rights conflict with Israel as the oppressor, occupier, and the Palestinians as the oppressed victim. And this type of dynamic continued through the same process, while the Jewish community, for example, was understandably preoccupied with the struggle for Soviet Jewry. This darker side of the human rights revolution and delegitimization of Israel was taking place. Then you had the denouement of the Cold War, the end in that sense of the East-West conflict, the turning to the struggle against apartheid. And this brings us to both the tipping point of the delegitimization process and its expression and the beginnings of the BDS movement in all its particulars. I'm referring now to the Durban Conference in 2001, where a world conference against racism was turned into a conference of racism against Israel and the Jewish people. And as someone who was there in Durban, there as a member of the Canadian parliamentary delegation, I won't forget, and even as we're talking, it's in my mind's eye, those demonstrations in the streets of Durban and the chanting in those demonstrations that the struggle against apartheid in the 20th century required the dismantling of South Africa as an apartheid state, and the struggle against apartheid in the 21st century requires Israel, the dismantling of Israel as an apartheid state, and then the framing of BDS, the demonization of Israel as a colonialist, imperialist, ethnic cleansing, child killing, apartheid Nazi state, the embodiment of all evil of the 20th century and constitutive of all evil in the 21st century.
Now, I think it's very interesting that you brought the apartheid analogy into it straight away, given that you, of course, knew Nelson Mandela. How is it that this label of apartheid has come to be applied to Israel compared to South Africa and the apartheid regime?
Well, one of the worst things you could do then and now in the world is to label somebody or something as being racist. The very label supplies the indictment. No further proof is required. And if any further proof is required, then you speak of Israel as an apartheid state. And this is not chosen accidentally. Apartheid is defined in international law as a crime against humanity. If you say that Israel is an apartheid state, you're saying it's a crime against humanity. If it's a crime against humanity, it has no right to be. And if that is not enough, then you refer to it also as a Nazi state. So not only does it have no right to be, but there is an obligation on us, the international community, to see that it has no right to be. So this is the framing of delegitimization under the ultimate cover of the human rights law, but in its most obscene sense.
And I think one of the particulars, therefore, of this movement is that, as you've just highlighted, Israel is seen as the very worst human rights violator in the world. Now, you're a distinguished human rights advocate. You've fought for human rights for decades. Can you lay this myth to rest right now about the Israeli place in the human rights pantheon?
Well, Israel, like any democracy, has to be held accountable for any breaches of human rights law. And Israel, like any other democracy, can be found to have, in certain instances, maybe breached certain canons of international human rights and humanitarian law. But the problem is not that Israel should seek to be above the law. The problem that Israel is being systematically denied equality before the law in the international arena. Not that human rights standards are being applied to Israel, they must be, but these standards are not being applied equally to anyone else. Not that Israel must respect human rights, she must, but that the rights of Israel deserve equal respect. And so the real phenomenon here is that where the inequality comes in is with respect to Israel and the international community, where it is systematically denied international due process. And so we find even the laundering of this delegitimization under universal public values, under the protective cover of the UN, where Israel is singled out for differential and discriminatory indictment, under the authority of international law, where incredibly last year the state parties to the Fourth Geneva Convention, the repository of international armed conflict, singled out one state in the international community to put it in the docket. It was not Russia, it was not Iran, it was not Syria, it was not North Korea, it was Israel. And so it continues in that vent, the laundering of delegitimization under the culture of human rights, and as we talk, under the struggle against racism.
Okay, so we know what this movement is, we know how it came into being. How does it get defeated? How does this, if you like, change in narrative get put back to where it should be?
I think what we have to appreciate is that BDS is not as some seek to portray it as a human rights movement, but really as an anti-human rights movement. And with respect to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in particular, it is prejudicial to the cause of peace, prejudicial to the cause of the Palestinians, prejudicial to the cause of human rights, prejudicial, if you wish, to global health, because if you go ahead and try to boycott, divest sanctions with regard to health, you will be depriving the international community of the great contributions that Israel is making to health, to science, to environment, to gender equality, and to LGBT equality, and the like. So, in effect, the BDS movement is corruptive of the whole culture of human rights. And what I've noticed when I go onto the campuses is that because the campus is a human rights culture, then one has to speak the language of human rights and effectively show that BDS is an anti-human rights movement rather than a movement which embraces human rights.
And if, therefore, there's one argument you would encourage those who are fighting BDS in a human rights context to make, what would that argument be? What should people be saying to those who are arguing for BDS in order to cut away at the core of their argument?
Well, you know, I would abstract from a recent resolution unanimously adopted by the Canadian Parliament, which said that criticizing Israel and Israeli policy is not wrong, but singling Israel out for selective opprobrium and indictment, denying Israel's right to exist, let alone calling for its destruction, is hateful, discriminatory, and anti-Jewish, and not saying so is dishonest.
I think one area where you can shed some interesting light on as a lawyer as well as a legislator is in the legal battle to fight BDS. How important are methods to do this?
I think the exposing and unmasking of BDS as the discriminatory movement that it is very important. And here the legislative remedy, which is anchored in anti-discrimination provisions, whether at the federal level or at the provincial level, or as you've had initiatives in the United Kingdom. This is the best way, not only on a normative level, to unmask the true assaults on human rights and the discriminatory character of BDS, but to give it effective remedy and sanction through the legislative and parliamentary process.
Irwin Cotler, thank you very much for your time. I'm afraid that's all we have time for now, but thank you for joining us for this edition of Current Affairs on JTV.